Theory. This is a free series on the subject of music theory. And the reason why I'm creating this and the reason why it's free is because when I tried to learn music theory, it didn't really make sense. Very few things in that made sense. And I was puzzled about why did we do it like this? Why did we come up with these concepts in that way? Why did we structure everything in this way? And why is it so poorly explained? And because if you can understand music theory like any other explanation, but if you really want to understand it, really want to know what's going on, so you can use it and really have that inner sense that you know exactly what goes on in music, then you want to approach it from a totally new angle. We really want to understand what it is that we're dealing with here, instead of just learning a bunch of concepts about it and then not really knowing what we're talking about. But what is the purpose of music theory? What is the central purpose of learning music theory? Because people can do without it, actually, all right? But there are two purposes. One is to teach and communicate, and that's really the same thing, right? If we can communicate something, we can start teaching it. And let's say you're in a band and somebody starts playing an A minor. Just knowing that that's an A minor is music theory. And so you can yell out, okay, let's jam an A minor. And what that instantly means is that we have chords in A minor, we have scales in A minor that we can use, and all that is music theory. So it enables you to communicate with other people and save time. Instead of having to listen for where the right notes are, instead of having to use your ear all the time, you can say, or conceptually, you can say, okay, this is the chord, these are the scales that fit, and I know why, so let me just do it right away. So it saves time when we're trying to communicate. If it wasn't for music theory, we couldn't really teach anything, because we didn't have names for chords, and we didn't have names for their relationship. We didn't have keys, we didn't have scales. All we could do was just play, and then that's the only way you could teach it. A great analogy is talking or speaking. If we don't have grammar, we cannot really teach how to talk or how to write. All we can really do is just to teach by doing, which is pointing to things and say, that's a house, that's a bicycle, and then, learning by doing. But because we have grammar, we have divided words up into groups. We have, words that point to things like house and bicycle. We have words that point to actions like verbs, driving or washing or stuff like that. And then we can start, putting up rules and say, okay, how do we use these things, these different types of words in a context? We put them together and combine them in different ways, and we can put up rules to that, and then we can start teaching it, which is pretty cool. But if you're not in the learning process, or if you're not in the playing process, if you don't need music theory, if you're doing fine without it, then I'm sorry, but you're not going to learn music theory. Because music theory, you can learn and be entertained by the concepts we're talking about in these videos. But if you're not using it, you're not going to remember it, because the brain is just going to say, oh, that's an interesting discussion, and then it's just going to just in one ear, out of the other, right? Because it's not useful. And so music theory only becomes relevant when it becomes useful, when you need it to figure out what scales to use, what arpeggios to use, when you're soloing, what rhythms you can use, or when you compose, or in trying to put chord progressions together and say, what is it doing there? Why is that chord progression sounding so cool? And then you need to start going into music theory. And so this is what this is about. So please, the first thing you need to be aware of here is that you need to use it. You cannot just learn music theory, or you can if you want to go around and say, oh, that's a minor 7 flat 5 that is derived from the 7th step of the major scale, which is also called the diatonic scale, isn't that? If you want to, if you have other usages for music theory, like significance or showing off or building an identity of a well-rounded, well-educated musician, then you might also, and there's nothing wrong with that, but then you might also remember it, but you have to use it in some way, right? So the second thing here is, what is music theory? Because most of us just see it as something, okay, it's just there. We have music theory, we have language, and we have grammar. But what came first? Well, music actually came first. So this is a common mistake, that people think that music theory has its own right to exist, and it doesn't. And it's not the objective truth about music. Let me just repeat that. It's not the objective truth about music. It's just words about music. It's just theory about music. So it doesn't really have anything to do with music. Music is the king. And so what happens to most people is that we start looking at music theory as its own thing, that it exists in its own right, and it doesn't. And it's not the truth. You can say anything about what you're doing down here. You can write a song without following any of the rules in music theory. But it tends to be like, okay, that's not correct because this is called a Phrygian sharp third and not the major. People can have discussions about what's the right way of pronouncing or determining what you're doing here from a music theory perspective. But music theory isn't king. It's just some people who came up with it, and they did so in layers. One guy came up with some concepts, then 100 years later, another guy came up with a new bunch of concepts about music. So it's all a big mess with it's really created generation after generation as music developed. So it's really a huge mess of concepts and irregularities and, things that don't connect and stuff like that. And that's why it can be a challenge to understand and to use if you haven't been really focusing on the basis of what goes on here. So it's the same thing with grammar, all right? It's a good example that people say, okay, you cannot say that. That's not the right way of saying that. This is not the right way of constructing a sentence. And this goes for, if you see the stereotype of the mature people or older people who point their fingers at the younger generation and say, you cannot use the language like that. That's not correct. You have to but that's how your language is. It develops constantly. And the ones who are developing are primarily the younger generation. They don't give a hoot. They just change whatever. They just make up new words if they feel like it. And that must become part of grammar eventually. And that's just the process. We have the older generation go, no, you can't say that. And then it takes some time before the younger generation really influences language in such a way so it ends up in the dictionary, so it ends up being part of grammar. But it's alive and it's fluent all the time. The danger of it is when grammar or music theory becomes a limitation. You cannot do that. You cannot put that chord in there. You cannot name a chord that way. You shouldn't. When it becomes, we start teaching stuff, and then suddenly the teaching becomes a limitation. Because that's the way you do stuff. And that's really the danger of the whole music theory layer on top of music, is that instead of it being something intuitive and creative, where you just create and you just listen for what you really like to hear, and then create from that, you start creating from mental concepts that are always based on the past, that are always based on and derived from what are we used to doing. And so it stifles and limits your creativity. And that's what we want to be very aware of when we focus on music theory. It's not the truth. It's just a way of communicating. And it's always, as I just said, a way of communicating what we're used to doing. And so we can break out of that, and it's not the truth. It's just a way of communicating or teaching.